Hi there. Now I wanted to do a video just talking about fuel proofing and covering three main kind of areas of why do we fuel proof things, when do we fuel proof things, and how do we fuel proof things. I mean, I've talked about fuel proofing in the past and done videos, but I wanted to look at it more holistically in the round. And I've got a wing I'm building here which I need to do some fuel proofing on, so it's a good opportunity. So why do we fuel proof our balsa models? Well, the simple reason is that balsa wood is very porous, and the fuel that we use, it's not only whether it's diesel, it's not only kerosene and ether, or whether it's glow fuel, methanol and nitromethane, but we also have quite a significant oil content in both those fuels. And if it leaks, then that oil is going to soak into the wood, and it's really, over time, particularly going to destroy the model. It's going to weaken joints, and it's really difficult to get out and resolve the issue once you've had a leak, if it's not fuel proofed. We also have oil that, even if we don't have a leak, we have oil that flies out of the carburetor half the time or out of the exhaust. So we're getting that spray of oil constantly on our IC models. And sometimes you have little gaps in your covering, or around engine bearers where oil can seep in, and it really does destroy a model over time. And once you have a model soaked in fuel or oil that hasn't been fuel proofed, there's very little you can do to recover it. I know there are things you can do, but the model will never be the same again. So when do we fuel proof our models? I mean, I used to think when I first started that you build your model, you cover it, and then you fuel proof it. But actually it's a little bit more than that. I think it's important that we fuel proof as we go along. So we do certain areas where we're going to lose space to actually get a brush in and start doing the fuel proofing, but areas that might be subject to fuel if we have a leakage. We also do a fuel proofing once we've completely finished the model and we've got bare surfaces. And we'll have a quick look at this wing in a second, but just a quick comment about ARFs. I don't think I've ever seen an ARF that's had any fuel proofing, a balsa and plywood built ARF. So if you do fly ARFs, it's really worth checking whether it's been fuel proofed or not. And if it hasn't, then it certainly needs one around the firewall, the back of the cowl, inside the engine bay or the fuel tank bay, because it will really last a lot longer if it hasn't been done. So anyway, let's have a quick look at this. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think that we're at a stage now where we should be thinking about fuel proofing. There's quite a lot of sheeting to go on, building. But this wing is going to have a fuel tank placed in the front leading edge there, and we're going to partially cover that, so just enough gap that we can slide the fuel tank in and out and place it in foam. But there's a recess here that the tank is going in that we really want to fuel proof, because if we have a leak in here and we don't fuel proof it, it's just going to soak into this, it's going to weaken the shear webbing, the spars, and we're going to have a failure. But the problem is, once this sheeting's on, we can't get a brush in there to actually fuel proof this properly. So before we put the sheeting on, we're going to give this a good fuel proofing all around inside that engine bay, and particularly concentrating on the joint areas where the fuel could seep through. And also, we mustn't forget that we're going to do the underside of the sheeting, so that when we put it on, hopefully we've got it pretty well sealed. I mean, I will put a drainage hole in the bottom here, so if there's a fuel leak, it goes out as quick as it can. But it's good to fuel proof the inside of that now, because essentially we're going to lose access as soon as this sheeting goes on. We are going to need to fuel proof around here, but we'll talk about that later. We don't want to do it now. We want to get this sheeting on, get the wing a little bit more finished, and then we'll fuel proof that. So we're going to do this in at least 2 stages, and I suspect probably 3, and we'll have a look at those as we go along with this model. Well, now we know why we're going to fuel proof, and we've seen that now is the time to do some fuel proofing, at least on this wing, and there's going to be more to come later. But the next question we need to ask ourselves is how we're going to fuel proof. Now, there are lots of different ways of doing this, and if it works and it's fuel proof for glow, diesel, whatever fuel you're using, that's great. The method I actually use is I use 30-minute epoxy, and I water that down with 95% ethanol. Now, you can use 75% ethanol if you can't get 95%. And essentially, I mix up the 2-part epoxy, 30-minute as I said, mix it up, get it nicely mixed, and then I thin it down with this alcohol, just so it's runny enough that I can brush it on nice and easy and it soaks into the wood, because you really want it to soak in and soak into those joints. So we'll have a look, we'll mix this up now and we'll get the epoxy in that fuel tank bay. Right, well, I've got my epoxy mixed up now, and you can see it's quite thick, as epoxy normally is. But what we're going to do, as I said, is we're going to thin it down with this 95% alcohol. So we're just going to put a little bit in to start with and give this a good mix. And the idea is it wants to be nice and runny, but not too runny. But it certainly wants to be thinned down so that it spreads on a lot nicer. And we can see already that is starting to look a lot thinner. And I may just put a little bit more alcohol in, and then we will start brushing it on. Now, this does take a lot longer to cure than normal 30-minute epoxy does, sorry. And I will probably leave this for a good 3 or 4 hours to make sure it's nice and dry. And now you can see how that is a lot thinner. So I mean, if you make it a little bit too thin, I don't really think it matters a great deal. So the alcohol will evaporate and we'll leave the epoxy. Now, I've got myself an old brush, but I will clean the brush after use, and so I can use it again. So all we do now is we just brush this into all those areas where we think it needs it, and like I said, particularly around those seams. Now, at first it doesn't look like it's actually going on, but it starts to just colour the wood a little bit as it goes on. And I'm not only going to be doing this area, I'm going to be doing the top of the spar as well a little bit, just in case we get a little bit of fuel seeping in. And just do around here. Now, I don't want to do it too thick on this top area. I'm going to try and thin it down as much as possible, because essentially when we're going to put the sheeting on there, I don't want it sort of lumpy and difficult to get the sheeting nice and smooth. And you can see now we can get right under that that leading edge spar there and make sure that this area really is well fuel proofed. I mean, if we do have a leakage in this area and it's not fuel proofed, then the fuel's just going to slosh around in here and soak into the wood, and it will do so much damage. Now, just do this area here. And what I will probably do as well is just do around the bottom of the ribs and the joints just around here. If I push it down there, just to really make sure we've got this bay nice and sealed. So I will get on and finish doing this, and I will also get the underside of this sheeting that's going to go on done. Right, well, I've now got that completely fuel proofed inside that bay, and I've put loads in the joints there, so it should be really well sealed. And as I said, I've done the underside of the sheeting. Now there is a little bit of a trade-off here, because we're going to get the protection of the fuel proofing, but the epoxy will just stiffen up that end a little bit and just make it slightly more resistant to wrapping around that leading edge. But it's lovely flexible balsa, so it'll still be easy enough to do it when the time comes. So we'll just leave this to dry now. Actually, just one final thing it's worth saying is that once it's had a few minutes to soak in a little bit, it's worth just wiping these edges down where we're going to be putting the sheeting, just to make sure that we get off the bulk of the epoxy. We don't want to go mad and wipe it all off, but we just want to make sure that these surfaces are nice where we're going to put the sheeting on. There we go. They look a lot nicer, and I think that'll be a good surface now for the sheeting. Well, this epoxy now has totally cured on the inside of this fuel bay, and you can see how well it's sealed around on the inside along the seams and the joins. So if we do have a fuel leak or a little bit of a spillage when we're filling up, hopefully it's not going to soak into the balsa, it's just going to drain out of a little hole in the bottom. And the sheeting that we put the fuel proofing on, the epoxy, is still fairly flexible. To be honest, it's hardly made a difference, so that will go on there still quite nicely. So the next stage for me is to carry on building this wing and getting it finished. And I mean, what I'm talking about today applies not only to a flying wing like this, but any kind of model aeroplane that we're building that's IC. So I need to crack on now and get this finished, and then we're going to do probably fuel proofing a couple more times. We're going to do it before we do the covering, and then we'll probably do it after the covering, but we'll come back and we'll have a look at that once I've got a little bit more building done. Right, well, I've now got to the stage with this build where actually all of the construction is finished and we need to start to think about covering it. But before we do that, we're going to do some more fuel proofing. Up till now, we've only fuel proofed inside here in this fuel tank bay where we're going to slot the fuel tank in. But we need to now think about what's going to be bare wood when we finish this model, and this is where the engine mounts, so it's going to bolt onto the side like that. So what we need to do is we need to fuel proof all of this area where we're not going to be putting any covering material, because if not, the oil and the fuel is just going to soak into this and ruin the model. We've also put in a couple of holes underneath that go into that fuel tank bay. This one I think I'm going to use as a drain hole from the tank. This one is a kind of a spillage sort of outlet. If we have a fuel spill, hopefully it will drain out of there. So what we need to do is we need to fuel proof around this area and make sure that if fuel does come around here, then it doesn't soak into the balsa. And I've just made those holes in there, so we've got raw edges on the inside, even though we fuel proofed inside the engine bay. Now you could say, well, why don't we just put the covering on and then fuel proof it? And the argument against that is that if you put the covering on and then fuel proof it, you'll only be able to fuel proof the timber up to the edge of the covering film. You won't be able to fuel proof under it. Now if the film then starts to work loose, you've got a gap for fuel to go in, and it will easily soak into the balsa, make the covering stick less and start to peel off. More oil gets in, starts to peel off. What we're going to do with this is, and I'm just reaching for a brush, what we're going to do with this is we're going to fuel proof this area, but we're also going to fuel proof about an inch, half an inch around where the covering is going to go, so that essentially we'll fuel proof all this bit here and the covering will go over the top of that. So even if the covering starts to lift up a little bit, the timber underneath is still fuel proofed. So it's protecting it a lot better than if the fuel proofing goes on once we've got the covering film on. So now I'm going to get on and fuel proof this in exactly the same manner as before. So thinning down this 30-minute epoxy with a little bit of 95% alcohol, and we'll have a look at what we've done when it's done. Right, well, I've now got this fuel proofed, and you can see I've been a little bit more generous than perhaps I said I was going to be, and you can see I've come out quite a way here with the fuel proofing. We've done all around the engine mount, and if I turn it over we can see around the hole here and the hole here, and I've even done the pinch point here where I'm going to stick on some wet and dry, but that's given it a really good coat. But you can probably notice that actually it looks a little bit kind of orange peely at the moment. So before I do the covering, I'm going to be giving this quite a nice sand just to make sure it's lovely and smooth and doesn't stand out like a sore thumb under the covering. Once we've got the covering done and the film is going to come around the engine mount across here and down here, then we will give this a second coat. Any of the bare wood, once we've finished the covering, will get a second coat, and that will just make sure that the wood itself is nicely fuel proofed, but it'll also seal around in these corners here where the film meets the wood. It'll just help to make it a little bit more fuel proof. Well, you can see we've got this quite nicely fuel proofed already, and once we put on that final coat, the third coat around the bare wood and around the join between the covering material and the bare wood, we'll really have this job done, and it'll be really nicely fuel proofed. And you know, it's worth taking the time and effort and getting this done right, because we really do put a lot of time and effort, months and months, sometimes years, into these models that we build. So we really need to give them the best chance and to fuel proof them and make sure they last well and we don't get oil and fuel soaking into the balsa and compromising the structure. Now, I was wondering whether I should do the covering and show you me putting the third coat on, but I don't really think that's necessary. I mean, we've covered the why, the how and the when, and I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it useful. So thanks very much for watching.